Good evening and welcome to Newsmaker Live, the first show for this year, and I think it's still safe to wish you a happy new year. Hopefully 2015 has gotten off to a good start and is treating you very well. Tonight we want to be talking about telecommunications, and the mobile and telecom sector continues to offer unprecedented opportunities for economic growth in both developing and developed countries, and the mobile communication services have become an essential part of how economies work and function. And to help us discuss the issues of telecommunications and related areas is the Director General of the OECS, Dr. Didicus Jules. Good evening and welcome to Newsmaker Live, Dr. Jules.
Thank you very much, Ken.
Okay. We started by talking about the economic importance of telecommunications, and I wanted to start by reading some stats. You talk about a doubling of mobile data use leads to a growth in the GDP per capita growth rate of 0.5% points. Countries characterized by a higher level of data usages per 3G connection have seen an increase in their GDP per capita growth of up to 1.4% points. A 10% rise in 3G penetration increases GDP per capita growth by 0.15% points. In developing markets, a 10% expansion in mobile penetration increases productivity in the long run by 4.2 percentage points. Stats that I think put things in perspective for us in terms of how the relation between telecommunications and mobile technology and economic growth. I read at one point that the ownership of cell phones, two cell phones perhaps, increases the GDP by whatever percentage. Perhaps you can start by putting things in perspective for us and how it is that technology, more specifically mobile technology and telecoms, contribute to economic growth.
Well, I think we need to recognize that the world has gone through, and global economies have gone through a series of transformations in the last couple hundred years. I think many people who would have studied economics in school would have heard of the industrial revolution, the shift from manual labor to the use of machines completely transformed economies. We are at that moment of paradigm shift where the use of ICT, information and computer technology, is now completely changing the way we work. Just think back 10 years ago where we were. There was no hardly an internet to speak about in St. Lucia. Very few people had cell phones. In fact, the cell phones were, at the time, were both phones, huge devices that you almost had to lug around. There was no instantaneous form of communication with other persons. In so many ways, the technology has transformed our day-to-day ways of living, working, and playing. And so these figures here reflect that. But there's one thing, though, that we have to be careful in quoting those figures, not to be too glib about it, because these impacts that have been described happen in economies and in societies where you have a very strong liberalization of broadband, where broadband is cheap, it is widely available, it is affordable. And it is also, because it is widely available and it is cheap, it is also empowering of the consumer. In other words, in an environment where the average person who has access to those technologies is able to use it for productive purposes rather than just consumption purposes. What we have in the Caribbean is a completely different scenario. We are living in for us, telecommunications is largely an extractive industry. I challenge all the telecommunication providers tonight to tell us what are the figures. Kishore, tell us what have been their profits in the last 10 years in the Caribbean, because these profits have been largely extractive. These are profits that have been made in the region by utilization of those services and the profits exported outside. It is true that they have contributed to social causes, but I have had occasion to question some of those social causes. It's largely the usual bacchanal stuff and so on, and not really investing as they ought to in the type of social, corporate social responsibility that would really help to boost intellectual property formation in this country, right? So the investments in areas like education, in training of young people, in mobile apps development, creative areas like that has been severely lacking. So we need to move from a consumer culture where we just use broadband for Facebook and WhatsApping and so on, to begin to use that technology for productive purposes. So from consumer utilization to content creation.
Yeah, but perhaps that requires a changing of mindset at more than just the consumer level, perhaps at the governmental level, at the commercial level as well.
For sure. It requires, I think more than anything, it requires a fundamental policy shift in terms of how we understand broadband and what its use is supposed to be. And with that, once that paradigm shift, that mindset changes, the policies that will follow from that. And that is why we at the OECS put this document out on the internet. We would really want this to go viral, because rather than people just getting stuck in the debate about Lime versus Digicel versus Columbus or whatever, there is need to have a very sober look at what is happening in the telecom sector from the perspective of what that can do as an instrument of transformation for us. We have I want to read a paragraph here from the document that talks about the
before you do, I just want to point out that the document you're referring to is a draft paper on advancing telecommunications policy and regulation in the OECS, recommendations based on trends, developments in the regional telecommunications sector. You say it's available online.
Yeah, it's on the OECS website, www.oecs.org. So what we're saying here is that there have been a lot of shifts in the technology and connectivity that are actually now redefining what we mean by efficiency, competitiveness, and productivity at not just the national and regional levels, but also the individual and the corporate levels. I mean, think of what the use of technology can do for businesses operating a business. You can have, Kendall, a website in which you are exporting products. Let's say you've developed some medicinal use for moringa, and you want to sell that overseas. You set up a nice website. You can be operating from your bedroom and nobody will know. You can look as glitzy as Microsoft. So the potential of that in terms of its transformative power should not be overlooked. The technical infrastructure now enables our modern economy to make a leapfrog into a whole different way of operating.
Now, in terms of getting people to move forward, yes, the document is online. We spoke earlier, a couple of weeks ago, Anthony Severin, in the office, the OECS Commission, about the need for the engagement of the media. Are you satisfied that the media has come on board in terms of putting forward the real issues at stake here? No,
I'm not, and that's why I was happy for this opportunity to speak to you. I think neither the media nor even the technology community itself in the Caribbean is sufficiently engaged on this issue. Because while, as I said before, while the immediate issue is the merger, the acquisition between Cable and Wireless and Columbus, this acquisition has provided us with a unique opportunity to start and to stimulate a debate about our wider strategic interests. And in fact, 2 weeks after we launched our document, President Obama was in the news calling for liberalization of broadband in very much along the same lines as what we are arguing here. In his case, of course, he's calling for a phenomenally larger provision of broadband than we have in these parts. But the trajectory is still the same, and the recognition of the potential of the technology to accelerate development is huge.
Well, obviously this proposed merger between Cable and Wireless and Columbus has generated a lot of discussion in the region, without a fear for job security as well as the implications for the consumer in terms of choice and pricing and that sort of thing, the creation of a monopoly. When the question comes up, looking at the global trends, and you talk about how dynamic the telecommunications sector has been, even a casual observer would have seen some of these things coming up and would question whether Ectel was caught with its pants down in this case.
No, I wouldn't say Ectel was caught with its pants down. I think Ectel was caught with a regulatory tool that was inadequate to the challenges of the thing. These companies are very sophisticated operators, and they understand the world of international business. They know how to hide their profits. They know where to register, how to move beyond the reach of regulatory authorities. I mean, you've seen, for example, the maneuverings in places like the U.S. Congress in order to establish accountability of companies that are registered overseas and offshore banking and so on. So the regulatory arm is always struggling to keep abreast of technology, of new ways of doing business, so that things can be held, people can be held accountable. And they are very good at that. So really, I think because we have never, I mean, our understanding, as I said earlier, of telecommunications is as a consumer technology. So, you know, it's provided as a service. We've never really sat and conceptualized telecommunications as an essential element of our national economy. And in fact, that slide that I provided, okay, I don't know if you can pull it up now, but if you can, what it would show is we were looking at the OECS. You know, the revised Treaty of Bastille has now established the OECS as a single economic space. And one of the critical objectives of the treaty is to facilitate the free movement, growth and development of people, goods, services and capital. Now, if you think about it, we've asked ourselves, what is required in order to make this freedom of movement and ease of facilitation of good and of growth for people, goods, services and capital? Transportation is going to be critical to all of those things. And transportation is no longer air and sea. It is also the broadband, it is the internet. So we've defined these three modes of transportation. And when we look at the potential in the OECS economy, there is a whole new economy that can emerge from the proper use of the internet and for the right investments and the right policy instruments, if the right policy instruments are in place. So Antigua and Barbuda, for example, is very advanced in its thinking with relation to the use of telecoms in areas like medicine, telemedicine. I mean, with telemedicine, you do not need to have, you know, or if it medical costs are extremely high. And you do not need to have necessarily the most sophisticated equipment in your country in order to benefit from those services. A surgeon in the UK can, with sufficient broadband available to a hospital in St. Lucia, can do a complete diagnosis of you remotely. It is possible. The U.S. Army Medical Corps are doing operations. Surgeons in the U.S. conducting field operations on people during the war in Afghanistan and so on. So, I mean, these things are not science fiction. These are things that are happening. And the cost savings of that, the efficiencies, the benefits in terms of the saving of lives is tremendous. So that's just one example of the way in which this can change. And so we are saying that we have to start to reconceptualize. Yes, we are concerned about the potential for the re-emergence of monopoly, but we need to be more strategic than even that, right? Because just being concerned about monopoly means we're still looking at it from a consumer perspective. We need to look beyond that to see what does broadband need to do. And for that strategic perspective, there are a number of things that need to happen in terms of, for example, the unbundling of services. Because right now, while we worried about monopoly from the perspective of who dominates the market, even within the market itself, there is a different type of monopoly at play that is not so visible to us, and that is the chokehold that the dominant players have on every aspect of broadband. You would have heard, for example, both Digicel and Lime were calling for the governments to start charging putting taxes on Skype and allowing them to, block Skype and these over-the-top services.
Yeah.
Now, these services really are innovations that have done a great deal of social and economic good. I mean, there are so many, hundreds of people, thousands of people in the OECS are using Skype to keep in touch with relatives abroad, to conduct business, to do interviews, video conferencing, and so on. And to talk about now, rather than innovate and look at more creative ways of growing that market and boosting productivity through the internet, the guys are looking to find ways of extracting more profit from it. And this is unacceptable.
Yeah. We're talking earlier about the emergence of the ICT as a key economic sector in the region. I can't help but refer to your previous post with CXC and your educational background in talking about an ICT labor market in the region. Are we heading in the right direction?
Well, we certainly try to head in that direction. I don't know if you're aware that there's a whole lot of work that was done at CXC with what are called the launch of new subjects that we call new generation CAPE subjects. Right. So we're talking about things like digital media. With digital media, you can develop mobile apps, you can do digital film. All of these things are done for your SBA. And in fact, the formula for the SBA in CXC is up to 40% of your final grade comes from the SBA. In the case of these new generation subjects, up to 60% of the final grade is the SBA, and the SBA is the actual creation of such a product. So the educational system can be ready to engage with those things, but what is hampering the thing is the access to internet. Governments are still paying exorbitant sums for schools to be locked into to be provided with internet. The volume of the bandwidth being provided to schools is ridiculous, because if you have a school of 500 students, provide them with a 10 megabyte connection makes no sense whatsoever, because 500 students feeding off 10 megabytes is a chokehold.
Now you talk about the need for innovation. Part of one of the issues highlighted in this document that we referred to earlier is how this emerging situation can potentially stifle not just innovation, but the economic development through small entrepreneurs who are coming out of the CXC subjects that you talk about and setting up their own small businesses. What are the implications for them?
Well, the implications is stagnation. If we don't free up the internet, essentially what we're asking for is freeing up the internet and making it affordable. We have set certain guidelines. We are saying to these people, whoever they are, whether it be Digicel or Lime or Columbus or whoever, that when we talk about broadband provision, we must set standards about what we mean. We must mean by that at the minimum 5 megabits, if not 10 megabits as a starting point. If you offer anything below that, you can offer lower entry levels like 2 megabits and so on, but don't call that broadband, because that's not broadband. In much the same way, we were bamboozled to believe that we had 4G. And that 4G actually was a mislabeled 3G. Right? So, we have to, again, this is where the regulatory tools need to be strengthened. The regulatory apparatus needs to be strengthened from the perspective of consumer protection, from the perspective of authenticity, that if I claim to offer something, then what I offer must mean what it says that it is offering. So there must be ubiquitous definitions and industry accepted definitions of what is happening. And I, as a regulator, need an independent capacity to monitor what is happening in that space. I had occasion to say to one of the providers, it's ridiculous that consumers are paying. I travel from Castries to Vieux Fort frequently when I have to travel internationally. And between Castries and Vieux Fort, a mobile call dropped 17 times. I actually checked it. And I can tell you, from Castries to Vieux Fort to Uanora, I can tell you exactly where the drop points are every mile along that road. Now, this is a major road artery in St. Lucia. This is not a backward area. So if you are claiming to be a major mobile provider, you must guarantee service in those areas, and any outage of service really should benefit the consumer. Should be given rebates on that. So there are a lot of consumer protection issues in there as well. And while we speak into it too, let me also say that even within the sector, while one has to respect the right of an employer in respect to their foray in the labor market, there are certain practices that I think should not be countenanced. There is the habit of, especially when you have changes in leadership and so on in some of those providers, to do massive redundancies of staff in order to show good profits at the end of the year. And what happens after those redundancies is that they turn around and hire some of the same staff who've been made redundant at significantly lower wages. There are cases, and all of that we are developing documentation on in the OECS to bring to the attention of governments, where third-party providers have been brought in, service providers have been brought in, and given contracts, and these third-party providers turn around and hire local companies to do the actual work. The markup they put on that work done by the local providers can be as high as 10 times what they are billed by the local contractors. So this is really not acceptable, we think. If you are interested in safeguarding the interests of your people as well, I think the staff in those telecom providers need to be also given some measure of comfort.
Yeah. Now, in terms of, well, obviously, across the OECS, the situation will be different in each of these islands in terms of national regulators and how their ability to come up against, as you mentioned earlier, these multinational corporations. What steps are we taking to ensure that there's some sort of agreement across the board, and how are we going to approach this as a region or sub-region?
Well, that's what ECTEL is there for.
Right.
ECTEL is the Sub-Regional Telecommunications Authority. They are the umbrella body that binds together the national regulatory authority.
Yeah, but based on what you said earlier, it seems that the changes in the telecom sector are happening a lot quicker than ECTEL can keep up with.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm saying part of our thrust, and we've been having those discussions. The chairman of ECTEL is the Honorable Gregory Bowen of Grenada, and he and I have been speaking on maybe almost every 2 days on various matters pertaining to this. So a lot of work is being done, and a lot of attention is being paid right now to the strengthening that needs to happen to ECTEL and to our capacity to effectively monitor and get on top of this.
Okay. I want us to go through this document and some of the areas that were highlighted for consideration. We talk about employment, which you touched on to some degree. We're talking about consolidation of telecom space, can trigger layoffs and related employee unrest. In the case of the Cable and Wireless Columbus deal or acquisition, it says that a deal would bring more than 3,000 Columbus employees into the Cable and Wireless fold, almost doubling the company's current staff. But it's possible that the staff count will be reduced upon completion of the acquisition. Yeah, so how do we protect our employees?
Well, you see, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We have to move to a higher level of sophistication in how we handle those things. You cannot tell an employer, especially in the case of an acquisition, that I cannot downsize and rationalize the staff.
Right.
The challenge is what really is the nature of that rationalization. If you're talking rationalization, then let it be an authentic rationalization. If there are two of us, like we are both linesmen, you work with Lime, I work with Columbus, right? We are linesmen, the companies merge. They need one linesman. One of us has to go. First of all, what I think, given especially the impact of unemployment in our economies, the fact too that a lot of the guys working in the telecom sector at all levels are relatively skilled dimension of our labor force, very reasonably specialized. The unemployment in that sector is something that must be attended to. So you can't tell them that they can't do the rationalization, but I think we have to be careful about the sort of predatory labor practices that actually make people redundant and then bring them back in for scab wages, and especially where they are hired by third-party outsource entities that in fact add huge multipliers to the work that they do, because what is happening is just a continuing exploitation of labor in ways that are inimical to the development of your own nationals.
The business continuity and disaster mitigation, we heard our Minister James Fletcher speaking extensively on that, especially on the backside of the trough, the December trough. I wanted to speak a little bit about the implications for disaster mitigation in the region of these emerging giants, telecoms giants.
Well, let me give you a simple example of how important business continuity is. Imagine a hypothetical scenario where we have a sudden event, like say a massive hurricane or cyclone or something, and all of the physical infrastructure gets wiped out. So like say Castries is hit by a tsunami and all of Castries is inundated. Beyond the loss of life and the tragic dimensions of the thing would be the loss of all business. Business disappears instantly. So the banks in Castries would have lost all their records. The bank itself is washed away. What happens to your money? What happens to the records of how does the bank get back on its feet? It must be able to pull its records back together. And that is where the internet becomes so important, because having offshore redundancy for your ICT infrastructure is very critical. Right now you have companies that you have these data farms in all over the world where people are able to have their records backed up, and they backed up within milliseconds of each other. The tolerance fault. In fact, when I was at CXC, one of the things we did was to sign an agreement with Columbus, who came into the market as a total disruptor, because they offered things that for years nobody else would offer. When they did offer at rates that were so exorbitant, it was prohibitive for people to do this. CXC now is backed up with guarantees, triple redundancy guarantees in 3 separate locations. If there is any event, disastrous event in any location, the records of the organization will not be lost. And the backing up is done within milliseconds. So the business continuity is assured in that case.
Now
and for every sector of the economy, medical records, it's vital.
Consumer choice. You talk here about TV viewers and internet users depend on choice, competition and diversity, and the acquisitions can threaten these important market enablers, giving dominant providers the power to extract rents at vital choke points in the multiplay value chain.
Not only, well, it means you have no choice but to accept what you get. It's a take what you get situation. That is the fundamental problem with monopoly. It is always take what you get. You have very little choice. You have nowhere else to go, and you have no pushback from the prices that you are being charged. You either accept it, or you can afford it, or you can't.
But beyond some of the points that you spoke about earlier, in terms of setting the playing field from early on when these players enter the game, you talk about the establishing of standards for and definitions for what is broadband, what's not coming in. But who or what body exists, if any, apart from ECTEL, in the region to ensure that there's proper competition existing?
Well, CARICOM had called for the establishment of competitiveness commissions, and there's been agreement within CARICOM to proceed with the establishment of these commissions. Some countries have it, like Barbados has a Fair Trade Commission. In the case of the OECS, we decided that rather than set up national commissions, competitiveness commissions, we'd set up a regional commission. And we are in the process of doing that. So in a way, this has caught us at a stage of unpreparedness to deal with it, but the commission is coming, and it will be a broad-based body that will be able to look at consumer issues and regulatory principles and so on to ensure that competition is preserved and consumer.
But that would have been started before this.
It started before, yeah. In fact, the legislation and everything was developed. Actually, what has held up, and the OECS heads have been quite firm in their insistence on getting this going. What has actually held it up is that at the last authority meeting, I sought the permission of heads to allow us some more time to take another look again at the structure that was being proposed, because I felt that if we take a better look at how we could leverage ICT, information computer technology, in that process, we may be able to save costs. So rather than set up a huge bureaucratic entity, we set up something that is lean but very effective. So one of the things we were looking at, for example, is how do we crowdsource some of the policing functions that needs to be exercised by the commission. So imagine a scenario where, there's most of these governments have price control departments. Now, no matter how many price control officers you employ, you will still need more price control officers. So rather than look to employ price control officers, why not outsource the price control function to the public themselves, to the consumer? So I go in a supermarket and I see if the price of chicken back is $5 more than it should be. I can go on my mobile phone, pull up an app, and register a complaint with a picture of the price and everything, right? And that gets aggregated at some central location. You can imagine a map of St. Lucia where every supermarket and store is mapped out. And, this lights up with complaints from wherever. It may be one particular location that is price gouging. It would show up instantly, right? And the possibility for, instant charging, again, if you change the legislation to allow that nimbleness of response, you can instantly deal with those cases. And you do it in a way that is a fraction of the cost. You could never have the manpower to the human resource capacity to do that if it were not crowdsourced.
Let's be due for a break. Let's take that break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation. We're talking to Dr. Didicus Jules, the Director General of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. We're talking about telecoms, liberalization, and the potential merger of Cable and Wireless and Columbus. Is it still potential? It's a done deal, basically.
It is a deal, but the point is, it's a deal for them. We can't prevent their merger, but we can insist on the conditions of their operation in the market.
All right. We'll be right back. Stay tuned.